My first question to deal with today is, why does the world need human rights? If you think back to the notion of how history developed itself and how humankind developed, you will find that there has always been this quest to somehow regulate and civilize and create mechanisms for order around us. So the original emphasis in law was to create a series of rules that would protect harmony, that would guarantee the safe possession of goods, and that would allow society to develop. So we have right at the outset there are two key questions, namely human rights and development. Yet when we celebrate law and we celebrate democracy and we imagine that law creates the orders, the fundamental question that remains is the extent to which the order that's created pays attention to questions of justice. On the one hand, law is set up to regulate society, create the ground norms through which order is maintained. On the other hand, law has an overarching importance, an overarching ethos to promote justice. Can you have order, and can that order be just? That's the quest we're interested in. When we celebrate democracy, we often think back to ancient Greece. The fact is, in ancient Greece, men voted, women were exempt, landowners voted, everybody else was exempt. So the oldest laws on the books were essentially written by the powerful to maintain the interests of the powerful. And yes, that did give us order. But what of justice? Did it give us justice? Did it give us enough of rules within society that would enable the protection of all? These are questions that have been at the forefront of the development of human rights. I would argue the world needs human rights for four primary reasons. First of all, the world needs human rights because it needs an overarching system that protects the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. That's important. Not just those who sit in the parliament writing the laws, but every individual. That's key, because we have decided that human beings are in fact equal, and that as a measure of that equality, we need to create the mechanisms through which their inherent dignity is promoted and protected. The second reason then is that if we create this kind of platform of equality and the inherent dignity of everybody, we will in fact have a bulwark, a platform within which everything else could progress. To go back to the questions of democracy and development, it will allow all segments of society to develop and not just the most powerful. A marker of our civilization is the fact that we no longer live with laws of the jungle, or so we believe. We no longer live where the most powerful and the most vehement will necessarily be the one who has all the rights. We argue that everybody should have rights, irrespective of whether they can express that in a manner that's suitable. I would argue the third most important reason on why the world needs human rights is to create mechanisms to control and rein in authority. If we don't create mechanisms to rein in authority, how do we know that that authority won't be used in the interest of the few at the cost of the many? If we, on the other hand, create strong statements in public life, in laws, we will ensure then that every authority that's used is used within lawful boundaries. And in creating those lawful boundaries, we will ensure that that practice of governance will be fair. A crucial element if we're going to embark on a journey that seeks to protect the human rights and promote the sustainable development of every individual. And my fourth reason for why the world needs human rights is in fact much more pragmatic. If you think about the fact that everybody has rights, and if we create a society where everybody's inherent dignity and rights are respected, we will ultimately include more sections of society now than we ever have at any time in history. By doing that, I argue, we will automatically move closer to peace and security. If you have a world where only few have and many desire, then that desire can be expressed in many different ways. That desire can be expressed by force, that desire can be expressed through rhetoric, but ultimately if there's no way in which that desire and that legitimate aspiration can be met, then you have a problem. Then you have a society that descends into violence, and you have a society that descends into insecurity.
الراجع وأنا كنت في الشارع أنا واثنين أطفال معي وقوم الحبيب كنا بنجابر ما درينا الله جنبنا قرحت ومشرت هضايا ملانتها.
Human rights is an incomplete project, it has to be said. There are a number of current challenges that are at the forefront of how societies operate. For a start, if you imagine human rights are located in law, you automatically imagine that it's through the law that you can gain your rights. Well, that might seem good, but in actual fact, you then need interlocutors who can represent you. If you are a vulnerable rural group in a distant land, if you are an indigenous tribal population living in an unconquered or unfettered part of the state, your access to that legal regime is limited. The legal regime itself, its trappings, its formulas, are all formulas that speak the language of power. How is it that you are going to be able to access your rights if you are a poor migrant woman in a rural part of the country? How are you going to be able to present your argument in a compelling enough manner for power to recognize, first of all, your problem, and then to bring the remedies that exist on the book to bear to alleviate your situation? And this is why I would argue that looking at the world of law and the world of human rights and the world of development through the lens of vulnerable groups is in fact the only test through which we can actually ascertain whether human rights are a pleasant series of rhetoric or in fact real rights that can be accessed. The challenges that exist are also of a more technical nature. Are there mechanisms through which we can create collective rights? What happens if the creation of those collective rights act as a new form of oppression on individuals? These are unanswered questions. Society has tried to address them in some shape or form with some degree of success, but the modules and the models they have come up with are not necessarily fully robust. We need to test them, we need to translate them, we need to transfer them to ensure that they take into account local aspects and local nuances that hinder their arrival and hinder their efficacy. Another challenge really is the question of how do we prioritize rights? If you look at the theory and the literature, we have often been overtly concerned with civil and political rights. That's because there's a certain political value in fighting against oppression. There's a certain political value in worrying about political rights. There's a worry in death penalty. There's a worry in terms of slavery. There are worries in terms of genocide and crimes against humanity. And these are legitimate worries because it's through these horrendous practices over time that human rights have been destroyed. So the challenges really are many. Can we, for instance, really be able to guarantee security without human rights? In the world after September 11th, 2001, what we have seen is a much greater emphasis on civil and political rights. That emphasis is stemmed from this belief that's oft repeated, that essentially we need to first and foremost worry about security. But security has been defined in a very narrow sense. Security has often justified collective punishment against people we think may be terrorists. If we take the security agenda and put it ahead of human rights, as has often been done in many jurisdictions, what we might actually do is push communities away. We might marginalize them further. We might point out to them that they have in fact no stake in the society we're trying to build. And in that sense, we might push them to further extremes. And as we know, there are plenty of people at the extremes who will willingly take them in and indoctrinate them to challenge the system, not through the force of argument, but really through the argument of force. So these are all the kind of challenges that we are going to have to look at in a very serious way if we think about the world in 2030, if we think about the world in 2050 and beyond. Essentially, we have the systems we have because the structures that have been created have privileged a few and have penalized the many. Human rights and the promise of human rights, as enshrined in more recent times in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, promised the world that we would in fact worry about the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. Here we are, much later, decades after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We can point to many successes. Human rights are mainstream. Human rights are in global constitution. There's an international human rights network that's been created. But the fundamental question remains, do we and are we sure that these regimes, these mechanisms, our legal systems have in fact created the bulwark to maintain the inherent dignity and worth of every individual? Thinking about human rights without sustainable development will not allow us to tackle the fact that poverty is a reality for a significant part of the world's population, and that if we don't tackle this equation of poverty and malnutrition and the fundamental basic social economic rights that go with it, the human rights we create will only be ephemeral and won't be of use to everybody.